Hello and welcome to the Ourdadsstamps YouTube channel, where we talk about all things related to stamps and stamp collecting. My name's Pete West and I'd like to thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoy it, and if you do, please click on the like button and don't forget to subscribe to get regular updates of new content. Hello again from Ourdadsstamps and welcome to another video. Unfortunately Sheila is not able to be with us today, but hopefully she'll be back for the next video and we look forward to speaking to her. In the meantime, before I start, I'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone who commented on my last video about eBay. It's always good to hear from listeners and to hear your views, and thank you once again. It was interesting to note that most of the comments backed up the findings of the statistics that I'd found, in that most people seem to buy and sell their items on eBay at the weekend. So that certainly gives me something to think about when I'm listing mine. Another thing I'd like to say before we start is I'm really excited to announce that I've surpassed the 1,000 subscribers mark. So a big thank you to everyone who has subscribed, every one of you, 1,000 people. I'm eternally grateful and quite frankly overwhelmed, but thanks, it means a lot. So for today's video, I thought I'd talk about Malta stamps. As many of you are aware, I specialise in Maltese stamps because it's the place of my birth and I spent a lot of time there as a child. And so it has a special meaning to me. And over the years, I've actually amassed 7 albums worth of Maltese stamps. So there's a fair bit to talk about, and this video may well run into 2 episodes. I'm not quite sure yet, so we'll see how it goes. But I thought I'd share with you some of the stamps I've got and just highlight a few interesting things. I'm not going to go through every single stamp I own, but just talk about the more interesting stuff. And it makes sense to do this in chronological order, so I'll start with the Victorian issues. And like a lot of British Commonwealth, British Empire countries, initially they used English stamps with a local postmark. In Malta, the initial postmark was just the letter M, standing for Malta. But as the number of countries that used British stamps grew, it was decided that this wasn't quite suitable, so all of them were changed to a letter and a number. And for Malta, it was A25. So you will find some British stamps with an M postmark, and then quite a large collection of British stamps with an A25 postmark. And these can be quite interesting, and I've actually made a big thing of trying to collect as many of these as I can. The interesting bit I find with these stamps is that, unlike most other things on eBay or on any of the other internet auction houses, you can usually pick up stamps for a fraction of the catalogue value. I look at round about 20-25% of catalogue value as the norm, unless it's a really nice stamp or something special. But with these stamps, with the Great Britain used in Malta stamps, they seem to be selling at almost catalogue value. Sometimes I've seen a lot that are selling for more than catalogue value, which makes no sense at all, because you might as well buy them from Sandy Gibbons as to pay that for it. And I'm not quite sure why this is so. Whether it's Sandy Gibbons have the values all wrong, which I don't think so, because the values seem to be backed up by other catalogues. It just seems people are after these stamps, so they're very popular, and it pushes the price up on places like eBay. And that's really stopped me from buying a lot more. Most of the stamps, the Victorian stamps, have a catalogue value of £20–30. Now, that may sound a lot, but it's not extortionate. And based on other stamps, you ought to be able to pick them all up for less than a tenner each. But I'm finding it extremely difficult to find any that are that sort of price, especially the ones that I'm missing. So it's an enigma, and I'm not quite sure why it's happened. I keep a lookout all the time on eBay for these sort of stamps that come up. And if there are any within my price range, then I certainly make bids for them. But at the moment, I'm not prepared to pay full catalogue value for them. So we'll see how this develops. On the flip side, it's obviously good news when I come across a load of them that I don't need, because selling them on is always quite easy and quite an attractive thing to do. So, as I said, we'll see how that develops. In 1860, Malta produced their own stamp for the first time. It was used for the local post, which was a halfpence per half ounce. And as I said, it was only used for inland mail, so things going overseas still used British stamps with the A25 postmark on them. But the halfpenny stamp, which is just an image of Queen Victoria in a laurel leaf, was first used in 1860. And this stamp is quite a difficult stamp to catalogue. It's been recognised that there were 28 different printings, and many of them are in different shades. So deciding which one you have is extremely difficult. Stanley Gibbons lists 19 different varieties, distinguished by shade in most circumstances. Some of the other catalogues only list 3 or 4 examples. So, as I said, it's a very specialist market and extremely difficult to distinguish between the two. And in many cases, you really need to look at differences in the printing as well as the shade of the stamp to be able to distinguish them properly. And this is something I haven't yet mastered. I have exchanged emails on several occasions with a guy called Neil Grover from the Maltese Study Circle. And he's been very helpful in giving me advice and hints and tips on how to separate these. And I've listed them in my album, as you can see, in the same way that Stanley Gibbons lists them. So they're by colour. But I suspect many of my guesses are incorrect. And it's one of the reasons why I've tried to get 3 or 4 of each different one, in the hope that at least one of them will be the right colour. The main distinguishing points with this stamp is the first 3 printings were done without a watermark. So in theory, they should be easy to find. However, in a lot of cases, you could be looking at a stamp that does have a watermark. It's just not particularly clear, or it's been squashed out of the stamp, if you like. So although the one you're looking at may appear not to have a watermark, you need to be careful, because there's a big difference between the value of a non-watermarked halfpenny yellow to the watermarked version. As I said, there were 3 different types without watermark. The first issue was on blued paper and is the most valuable of stamps, so that should be slightly easier to distinguish. Then in 1863, they issued the stamps on a watermark paper with Crown CC as the watermark. In most cases, this shows up fairly clearly. In Stanley Gibbons, there are 14 different varieties with the Crown CC watermark. And as I said, most of them are only distinguished by colour. So it's very, very difficult to make the difference between each. It's a very subjective thing, and it's one I've tried to do, but I suspect there are some mistakes in this. There's a couple of printings that you can tell. There's a couple that use perforation of 12.5 instead of 14. So obviously if you check the perforations and you've got one with 12.5, that narrows it down to just 2 types. And also there's a combined perforation of 14 by 12.5. Again, this is 2 different varieties, so those 2 should be slightly easier to distinguish, but even so, it's a big task. And the most common ones of these stamps are the Crown CA watermark, of which Stanley Gibbons lists 2 types, which are reasonably easy to distinguish if you've got both. One thing I would say before we leave the topic of the halfpenny yellows is you have to be careful. Stanley Gibbons prices, as always, are for perfect examples of this stamp. There are many, many mint examples of the halfpenny yellow without gum, and this detracts a huge amount from the value. There are also many, many of these stamps with indistinct postmarks, or that over time have lost their colour, have become faded in sunlight, or the colour's been washed out by removing them from envelopes. So you do have to be careful, because there's a lot of the inferior stamps around, and you can pick those up for a £5. But to get a really good one, and in all honesty, many of mine are the lower value ones, but to get really good ones, then that's when you have to pay the premium. In 1885, it was decided to discontinue using British stamps for overseas post, and Malta produced their own stamps. And there was a set of stamps with Queen Victoria's head on issued, up to 1 shilling, and then there was an additional 5 shilling stamp issued a bit later. These are fairly readily available, especially used. They're not particularly hard to find. There are quite a few shade variations, so you need to watch out for those. And again, be careful that you're not buying a washed out version rather than the pale version. Again, it makes a difference. So be aware, but as I said, they're fairly easy to get hold of. And then in 1899, they were one of the first countries to issue a pictorial set. And these were to be used in addition to the Queen Victoria set that had already been printed. Again, fairly easy to get hold of, especially used. As you would expect, the higher value is a bit more difficult, but nevertheless, it's not a difficult stamp to find. Then we get to the 1 penny overprint, which is an interesting story, shall we say. In 1899, Malta decided to join the Imperial penny postage scheme, so there was a big demand for 1 penny stamps. And at the same time, or very shortly afterwards, before they had a chance to print any more stamps, Queen Victoria died. So they didn't really want to print a whole load of 1 penny stamps that were going to be obsolete. And they weren't yet ready to print Edward VII stamps. So it was decided that a 1 penny overprint would be used on the 2 halfpenny stamp, of which they had loads left over. And this was carried out by the local government printing office in Valletta. However, the Postmaster General at the time saw this as an opportunity and instructed that one of the stamps should be printed with an error. And instead of spelling the word penny, it would be Pnney. And he printed a total of 12,000 errors, which were then sold over the counter for his profit. Once this was discovered, the Postmaster General was forced to resign. But it was decided that because there was still a lot of the original 2 halfpenny stamps that hadn't been overprinted, there was the opportunity for forgers to overprint with this error. And so the remaining stock of 2 halfpenny stamps were marked with a red tick in the top left-hand corner. Now, it's just a red tick with a pen, so this could then be forged itself. So you need to be a bit careful if you're considering buying this type. By 1903, new stamps with Edward VII's head on them appeared. There are 2 distinct sets here, one with Crown CA watermark and one with a multiple Crown CA watermark. Again, both are quite readily available in used condition. The multiple Crown CA does include a 5 shilling green and yellow, which is a bit more difficult to come across, and as you would expect is quite a lot more expensive, but they are around. Following the death of Edward VII, we then saw a new set with King George V's head in 1914. The lower values up to a shilling used a similar sort of design with a medallion portrait of the king in the middle. The larger values, the 2 shilling, 2 and 6, 5 shilling, were of a design which was used throughout the Commonwealth and printed by De La Rue. And like the similar stamps throughout the Commonwealth, these contained many flaws and varieties that if you're into that, then there's a huge amount that you can collect and a huge amount of money to spend on these to collect. At this time we get Malta's most valuable stamp, of which I do not own a copy, unsurprisingly enough. This is the 10 shilling black with a multiple Crown CA watermark. The current catalogue value of this is 3,250 mint and 4,750 used. It's the similar design to the one used in 1899, just a slightly different frame, and the words postage and revenue on the side as opposed to just postage. There are a lot of forgeries of this, so you need to be careful if you're buying one. Certainly if it comes at a low cost, then the chances are that it is a forgery. Some of the King George V set were also reissued in 1921 with multiple script watermarks. And then in 1921, autonomy was first granted to Malta, and all the stamps were overprinted with self-government. Again, some in multiple crown watermark, some with a multiple script watermark. Later that year, in 1922, it was a new set of stamps were issued to reflect the autonomy of the Malta government, and these are known as the Melita set. These are quite an attractive set with a similar design up to sixpence with an emblematic figure representing Malta. It's a slightly more ornate design for the higher values from a shilling up to 10 shillings, and then another design for the £1. And the £1 comes in a sideways watermark and an upright watermark, both of which are quite expensive to buy, particularly used. They're actually cheaper mint than used in this case. A few years later, the postal system was changed so that they had different stamps for postage than for revenue stamps. And so the Melita set was overprinted with the words postage. And again in 1926, a completely new set of stamps were issued. By this time, stamp collectors were getting a little bit annoyed with the Malta postal system. It was felt that they were taking advantage of collectors by producing so many different sets to collect and merely using stamps as a money-making exercise, which it never was in those days. So a new set was issued in 1926. The lower values up to sixpence just show a picture of George V in the top right-hand corner and a shield and the words Malta on the left-hand side. But the higher values, in my view, are some of the most attractive stamps that Malta produced. And each one is different from a shilling, 1 and 6, 2 shillings, 2 and 6, 3 shillings, 5 shillings and 10 shillings. They're all very attractive stamps in my view. And again, not hugely expensive mint, but they are much more expensive used. And when you buy used copies, naturally enough, you need to make sure they are genuinely used and not forged. So look out for the postmark and make sure it's a real postmark. Things started to get a bit messy then, because having decided on separate stamps for postage and different stamps for the revenue, in 1928 they went back to having joint stamps for postage and revenue. And so this same set was overprinted with the words postage and revenue. And then 2 years later, a whole new set with exactly the same design but the words postage and revenue on them was printed. So in the space of 4 years, Malta produced 3 sets that were ostensibly identical sets, just with a change in the words from postage to overprinted postage and revenue to postage and revenue. These stamps at the time proved not very popular, and it's possibly one of the reasons why they're more valuable. But also, I should imagine the short length of time they were in use contributed to that as well. As I just said, I think these are some of the most attractive stamps that Malta has produced, or certainly the high value ones. And it's taken me a while to collect a full set of each of these, but it's definitely worth the wait, and I'm very happy with it. Like all Commonwealth countries, in 1935 Malta produced the Silver Jubilee set. These stamps contain the same varieties and errors that all the Silver Jubilee stamps do. So again, it's something that you may wish to look at. The basic stamps themselves are reasonably inexpensive, but the varieties, obviously, depending on which variety it is, can become very costly. That seems to be a good time to wrap up this video. As I said at the beginning, I suspected this would run into 2 episodes, so I will continue with George VI and some of the Queen Elizabeth stamps. I personally have only gone up to decimalisation in 1971. After that, they just produced so many stamps that it was becoming more and more difficult to keep up with it. So decimalisation was a good time to stop. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. Don't forget you can visit my online stores at eBay and Delcamp under the name of Ourdadsstamps, where I have over 2,000 items for sale. Please join us again in 2 weeks' time for another edition of Ourdadsstamps podcast.